What's a creepy experience you have lived through? Story 1. When I was maybe 19 or 20, I nearly got run off the road on my way home from work one night. There was no actual accident, but it shook me up so much that I pulled over onto the shoulder to calm down before continuing to drive. A windowless van pulled up behind me and a man got out and approached my car. He asked if I was okay, and I told him I was fine, just gathering myself after a scare. He offered for me to wait in the van with his wife and kids. He insisted multiple times that I get in his van. Luckily, my door was already locked, and I had only cracked the window to speak with him. Since he parked his van right behind me, I could see in my rearview mirror that there were no visible passengers inside. Story 2. I was once at my girlfriend's townhouse, and they had a backyard with a shared fence with a family, or maybe a group of families. It was a dark night, but one of those nights when the light of the town reflects off the clouds, so it's eerily bright outside. The fence between the town home and the family house was old and worn out, so you could see through the gaps if you really focused. We heard a blood-curdling scream, "No!" followed by an immediate crushing gasp. There were about 50 feet between the glass sliding door where we stood and the fence. They had their floodlights on, and it illuminated the silhouettes of the parents crying. Peering through the fence from 50 feet away, we could see a body swaying from a tree. Their son had taken his own life, and they discovered it in the dead of night when their dog ran into the backyard and activated the floodlights. We could only see through the small gaps in the fence and the shadows of the family experiencing it in real time. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. Story 3. When I was 19, I was 7 months pregnant with my oldest daughter. I still lived with my parents and came home after work around 11:30 at night. I usually checked that the vehicles were locked before going inside, but this night I was suddenly overcome with a sense of immense fear. I would not even look toward my parents' vehicles and hurried straight into the house. 20 minutes later, a man was knocking on our door, telling us that my parents' sport utility vehicle was on fire and that we needed to get out of the house. He saved our lives and we called the emergency number. There was a serial arsonist on the loose in our town, and when he was caught and confessed, he admitted to watching me come home that night. He also admitted he was preparing to hurt me in case I had caught him, but I never looked in his direction as he was sitting in my parents' vehicle when I arrived home. It took years before I was able to be outside at night alone. Story 4. I was home alone for the weekend when I was in high school, which was exciting for me since I had never really had the house to myself. I had a few people over on Friday night and drank too much. Then the next night, it was just me at home alone. I had a case of beers left over and a movie to watch. So I decided that the hangover would not keep me down and that I would party by myself and have an awesome night. I ended up getting far too drunk and felt hungry. I decided to cook some pasta in a drunken haze. I was singing loudly while I played chef in the kitchen, thinking I was amazing. Halfway through singing and stirring the sauce, I heard a tapping sound, and some movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. One of the metal chains used to pull the blinds up and down on the glass doors was moving and hitting the glass, making a tapping sound. I froze as I watched it moving back and forth by itself. Then I realized that it was not the only chain moving. We had around 7 sets of blinds on the glass doors, and all 7 of the chains were moving back and forth. My hair stood on end, and I walked out of the kitchen as all of them were tapping against the glass doors. No windows or doors in the house were open, and the tapping was becoming louder and more frequent. I turned around just in time to see the case of the movie I was watching slide off the television cabinet on its own. I let out a slurred, "Forget that," and bolted outside, completely terrified. On the way out, I saw the painting next to the front door had been tilted. I gasped, ran out the door, and was so scared that I even wet myself a little. Outside, I was distraught and horrified by what had just happened. I was convinced the house was haunted. I realized that I had left the stove on and needed to go back, grab my phone, and get out. I psyched myself up, ran back inside, turned off the stove, grabbed my key, my phone, and 10 beers, then headed to the park to try calling someone. No one picked up since everyone was wiped out from the night before. I vaguely remember being at the park before I blacked out, then later crying in my kitchen, and then nothing. The next day, I woke up in my bed. I wondered whether it had just been a dream, but when I walked out and saw the pasta and the movie case, I realized it had really happened. Later, I logged onto social media and saw multiple statuses saying that there had been a minor earthquake during the night. Needless to say, I felt like an idiot, but the truth is it was the first earthquake I had ever experienced, and they do not usually happen where I live. Story 5. When I was about 6 years old, my parents dropped me off at a swimming lesson class. This was back in China more than 2 decades ago, and I remember that class had a lot of students. I was scared of the water and did not want to go in, and the teacher became frustrated and tossed me into the deep end. To this day, I remember clearly the panic I felt, the sheer fear as I choked and gagged on the pool water while sinking lower and lower. It felt like ages before the teacher shoved a long pole into the pool for me to grab onto so I could be pulled out. I remember the sensation of panic and the edges of my vision darkening. For several years afterward, I was so terrified of water going over my face that I even had trouble showering and washing my hair. I had to force myself to take a deep breath, go under the water, scrub as fast as I could, and step back out. Every time my heart would race, and I would be on the edge of a panic attack. It was not until my mid-20s that this came up during a family visit, and my grandmother told me that when my grandfather found out what had happened, he became so angry that he called in favors from his army friends, literally old revolutionary soldiers from Mao's days, to show up with high-ranking government officials and frighten that swimming school and teacher. Story 6. The campus house that I lived in had a very disturbing history. People had lost their lives there. Previous owners had passed away, and it was incredibly old. I stayed there all summer alone because of my job in my college city, and every night I would hear strange things. Before, I always thought it was one of my 4 roommates making noise, but now I was completely alone. Almost every night I heard odd sounds. The first day I moved in, I went upstairs to my room, and the second I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a door slam downstairs. Throughout the summer, I heard footsteps, doors, and all sorts of other sounds. I was almost sure, and still think to this day, that there was a squatter who somehow avoided me all summer. There were mornings when the front door would be unlocked, even though I vividly remembered locking it the night before. I would say out loud to myself, "Okay, here I am locking the door," and tug on it to make sure, but it would be open in the morning. Maintenance usually came by periodically, but when I called them, they told me they had not been there. The creepiest part was the door to the attic. It was a regular door, not one of those pull-down ones. Some days it would be slightly open, and I would shut it, even placing a chair in front of it, but it would still end up slightly open. My roommate came down one weekend when I happened to be away, and he said he also heard banging noises throughout the night. One day in desperation, I yelled, "If there's anyone squatting here, I literally do not care and you can stay, but let me know you're here so we can set up some simple ground rules." I'm chill, I thought I heard some rustling from the basement, but nothing ever happened. Funny enough, if there had been a squatter, I would not have cared too much. It was the college's house, so if someone wanted to be my roommate for the summer, I would have been fine with it as long as they were not dangerous. Story 7. My sister had been telling me for years that something was going to happen to her in the year 2020. She had a little girl in the year 2017 and insisted she had the baby for me, since I have no children. In the year 2019, our father passed away, and they were not on good terms. My mother had also died estranged from her, and that was hard on her. I, on the other hand, had been the one to take care of both of our parents. Then the pandemic happened, and not long after, her son was assaulted. In April, my uncle's younger brother, one of the best men I have ever known, passed away. We were devastated. In June, we began to notice her odd behaviors, and within a week, she began the most destructive and shocking downward spiral. I had to remove my nephews from her home. She was in what we now know as a manic episode. Before all this, she had been incredibly bright, though she was always the most stubborn person alive. In a heightened state, she was completely unwilling to seek help. We had her committed several times, but nothing worked. She has been arrested and jailed, and even committed by the police. We are still trying to help her, but her condition has deteriorated in such a way that we know she may not survive. She now lives in a world completely separate from us. The worst part? She has posted everything on social media since June. Watching her deteriorate through those posts has been horrifying. It scares me deeply because our brother has the same mental health struggles. It is terrifying how quickly the mind can turn against us. Story 8. Back in June, my boyfriend and I went camping at a spot we had visited many times before. It was pretty remote, and the campsites were very far apart, about 400 feet between them, with trees blocking the view. There was no service and no ranger station within about 30 minutes of driving. Since it was bear country, I kept my bear spray on my hip. My boyfriend told me he had forgotten our firearm at home because he had missed the box when packing, so all we had was the bear spray. We had a nice evening and went to sleep with our dog in the tent. My Subaru was parked perpendicular to the tent opening, forming a barrier in front of our site. I woke up while it was still dark to my boyfriend sharply whispering, "Get the bear spray now." Half asleep, I asked if it was a bear and pulled the bear spray out of the holster, excited at the thought of maybe seeing one. What he said next made my stomach drop. "No, it's a person." He later told me he had woken to the sound of a door handle jiggling. He and the dog stared at each other in confusion before he unzipped the tent to look out. Just before dawn, I could see the faint light outside through the front of the tent. My boyfriend, who is usually gentle and quiet, suddenly started yelling at the top of his lungs, "Get out of here!" His voice was so loud and forceful that it startled me. Holding our little 40-pound whippet mix in my arms, who was shaking and cowering, I peeked outside alongside him. Just 10 feet away, crouched near my car, was a huge man dressed in black, trying and failing to hide behind the vehicle. My boyfriend kept yelling, but the man wouldn't move. Then he stood up and just stared at us. He was extremely close, and we were completely alone. He had heard us talking about the bear spray, so he probably knew we didn't have a gun. I stuck the bear spray out of the tent and shouted in my most intimidating voice, "Do you want to get sprayed? Leave now." The man finally began backing away slowly. He didn't appear to be armed, but his body language screamed that if he wanted to, he could overpower us. He was massive, at least 6'3", bulky, and unsettling. Eventually, he turned and started walking down the road. My boyfriend and I scrambled to pack everything as quickly as possible, watching him the whole time. He walked with a strange swaying motion, swinging his arms and waddling, which made me think he was on drugs. I'm a nurse, and I've seen people act that way before. Just as we were almost ready to leave, I made the mistake of running to the end of the campsite to see where he had gone. My boyfriend shouted for me to come back as I saw him returning, dragging a huge branch behind him. He was only about 10 feet from me, and I had left the bear spray in the car. I backed away and he stopped directly in front of me, blocking the exit to our site. He stared at me with a look that still gives me chills to this day. Sinister, deliberate. Without breaking eye contact, he dropped the branch to block our way out, then walked down the road again before cutting into the forest behind our site. Terrified, I ran to grab our dog tied at the back of the site, convinced more people might jump out of the bushes. My boyfriend threw the branch aside and we sped off down the road. Along the way, more branches and logs had been placed in the road, not in a way that really blocked us, but in a strange, disorganized attempt to slow us down. It only confirmed to me that he was likely on drugs. We drove while honking to wake up any other campers who might be nearby, and then headed straight for the highway. Once we had service, we called the emergency number to report the man. They took a description and said they would send someone, but I doubted they would put much effort into finding him. I don't know what his true intentions were. Maybe he just wanted to steal something, but the way he refused to leave, the way he blocked us, and especially the look he gave me, made it clear it was something darker. It felt predatory. To this day, I still see his stare in my nightmares. My boyfriend and I swore we would never forget our firearm again. Story 9. In 2016, I laid my motorcycle down going about 45 miles per hour. When I realized I was going to crash, I had just enough time to understand that it was not going to end well. Everything went black, and then I came to, standing in the middle of the road watching the crash. I watched my body flop across the pavement and did not feel much of anything. Everything around me was more real than I had ever known. The colors were brighter, the birds chirped in the most beautiful way imaginable, and everything felt focused, except for my body and bike, which looked somehow different. I do not know how to describe it. I sensed a male presence, though I never saw him, silently push me back, and suddenly I was back in my body. I sat up in the ditch, wiped the blood from my eyes, and slowly got up to start walking for help. I was alone. I could not lift my bike, and I had not told anyone where I was going. I made a lot of mistakes that day. Going alone, riding without a license, taking back roads I did not know, not wearing protective gear, and not wearing a helmet. I was careless, but that experience changed my life. Storytime. When I was 15, my mom dropped me off at the library in our town center to meet a friend for a school project. She left to run errands while I went inside. On the way in, I noticed a homeless man sitting on a bench nearby. I felt uneasy, so I quickly walked inside without looking at him much. While I was looking for a book, my mom suddenly appeared. Less than 2 minutes had passed since she had left. She chatted with me casually, then told me to pretend to look for a book on the bottom shelf. Confused, I followed her instructions. She then whispered, "You are being followed by the same man. He is not alone." Sure enough, the man had come inside and was pretending to browse, but he was watching me closely. Another person was with him, though I could not tell if it was a man or woman. My mom had noticed them as she was pulling out of the parking lot, so she turned around immediately. I do not remember exactly how we got out of sight, but thankfully, my friend never showed up that day. Story 11. My dad used to wake me up in the middle of the night to confront me about things I had not done correctly or had not completed. He had severe anger issues. Once or twice, he threatened and even tried to push me out of my third-story bedroom window. He also strangled me to the point where I blacked out. I think he knew when to stop, but it became frequent enough that I would wake up on my own around the time he usually came for me. I would lie there with my heart pounding, unable to fall back asleep, full of dread and near tears. By the time I got to high school, I started fighting back, yelling at him and pushing him away whenever he came too close. At first, it only made him more violent. One night he pushed me off the third-floor banister, but that same night I held up a clothes hanger and threatened to hit him back if he touched me again. That week, I went to school and told a teacher. They called the police, which at the time made me furious because it was more than I wanted. But looking back, I am grateful to that teacher with my whole heart. Story 12. This story has nothing to do with the paranormal, but it was an unforgettable experience I had while living with my father, who was a recovering alcoholic. For most of my life, he struggled with hard liquor and repeatedly failed attempts to quit. He would often be sent to rehab, and I would be placed with different caretakers, some of whom were abusive. Determined not to have me sent away again, he tried quitting without rehab. He also worked at the Salvation Army, so if he got caught drinking, he could lose his job. He lied often, so I never asked too many questions. It was the first time I ever witnessed serious withdrawal symptoms, and I did not understand what was happening. The first stage happened during a meal at a Salvation Army event. His hands shook so badly he could not bring food to his mouth. He eventually gave up trying to eat. He was irritable when sober, and it only got worse. The second stage happened late at night. I woke up to hear him talking to the neighbor for a long time, except no one was there. He was having a full conversation with no one. At first I thought he was on the phone, but he was not. The third stage was the worst. We were sitting outside near the apartment pool when he pointed at the trees and asked, "Do you see them?" I asked what he meant, and he said, "The bobcats in the trees." He was hallucinating and believed it completely. He saw other things too, but that is the one I remember most. The final straw came one morning when he tried to ride my bike to the store. He only made it about 20 feet before falling and knocking himself unconscious on some stairs. I was too scared to help, but neighbors rushed over. He was completely out of it, unaware of what was happening. I was only 15, and I had never seen him like that. My dad was once a mathematical genius and an electrician journeyman, and seeing him in that state was devastating. He was hospitalized for a long time, and I had to stay with a friend. He kept drinking afterward and eventually passed away 7 years later from liver and kidney failure. Story 13. I was out to eat with my family, and my dad, who is usually calm, was about to eat the Cubano sandwich he always orders at our favorite spot when he suddenly yelled, "Holy!" and turned pale. I asked what happened, and he stammered that some man had just fallen. I turned around, and there was a man lying motionless on the pavement. Without thinking, I darted out of the restaurant and ran across the street, not even looking for cars to try and help him. I am lucky I did not get hit. Sadly, it was too late. Blood was pouring out of his mouth, head, and nose. I shouted at him, trying to get a response, but he remained motionless. I turned away and called the emergency number. Either someone had already called or by chance a fire truck was nearby because first responders rushed over. But it was too late. They immediately placed a white sheet over him. A week later, a detective called me. They ruled out self-harm, so it may have been an accident or something worse. He had fallen from the fifth floor around dinner time. I saw his face in my mind for weeks afterward. I still have no idea what truly happened, and I have not gone back to that restaurant since. The unsettling part was that his bloodstain remained on the pavement for months, faint but still visible, with people walking past it unaware. A strip of red tape clung to a pole, weathering away, and no one ever left flowers. I often wonder if he could hear me screaming at him, or if he was already gone. Story 14. When I was around 13, I had a habit of staying up late on weekends to try and beat whatever Nintendo 64 game I was obsessed with at the time. One night, I moved my setup to the living room. Our house had a hallway that connected to the bedrooms, and strangely, it had a door. After moving everything, I closed the hallway door so I would not wake anyone. About 2 hours into playing, I started hearing tapping noises. I paused the game, and the noises stopped. Then about 10 minutes later, the tapping came back, louder this time, and coming from the sliding glass door in the den. At that point, I ran to wake my dad. He rushed outside and saw someone jump the fence. Later, the police told us that someone had escaped from a nearby mental hospital earlier that evening. The creepiest part was that the glass on the sliding door was close to breaking. I never again played video games in the living room at night, and since then, I have suffered from night terrors and a deep fear of looking out windows or doors after dark. Story 15. This happened when I was in 7th or 8th grade. School had just let out, and it was pouring rain. I walked over to a church parking lot next to the school where my mom usually picked me up. There were other kids waiting for rides, but my mom's car was not in the usual spot, so I stood still and texted her to ask where she was. While waiting, a man grabbed my attention and asked if I wanted to get into his van to get out of the rain. I had never seen him before, and there were no kids in the van. I told him no and said I was fine. He asked again, and I declined, walking away just as my mom texted me where to meet her. Looking back, I probably should have reported it, but my mom's car was far from his van, and by then, he might have already left. Nothing ever came of it. No kids were reported missing, so thankfully no one fell for it. Still, it was unnerving, and I sometimes think about the what-ifs, especially since I never told anyone at the school about that man. Story 16. One night someone tried to break into our house. My kids were asleep, and I was doing laundry in the back of the house. As I walked from one side of the house to the other, I guess someone saw me through the kitchen window. Soon I started feeling vibrations, almost like someone was pounding. At first I thought maybe one of my kids was awake, but when I checked, they were sound asleep. Then I heard it again. It was someone moving from door to door, pounding and kicking. I panicked and, instead of calling the emergency number, I called my husband. He reminded me that we had a firearm, but it was in my car, which was in the garage, and the garage was open. I was terrified but decided to go for it. As soon as I opened the car door to grab it, a man came around the corner of the house right in front of the garage. He did not see the weapon, but he heard it when I cocked it. He panicked and started saying someone was after him and that he was just trying to hide. Meanwhile, my husband had already called the police, and they showed up with me standing there, weapon in hand, pointing at the man. He was lucky the officers arrived and that I was too scared to pull the trigger, because that night could have ended very differently. Before this, I had been strongly against having weapons in the house. Afterward, I got my concealed carry license, and we bought another firearm so we would always have one in the car and one in the house. Story 17. All throughout my childhood, whenever I slept in my parents' room, I had to have the closet door shut. If it was left open, I would see shadowy figures walking through the doorway. They would disappear if I shut my eyes for a moment, but it was unsettling. Fast forward to high school when our house was remodeled, and a corner of my room ended up where that closet once stood. During my junior year, we got a new dog. This dog would sleep anywhere in the house, except in my room. If I tried to keep him there at night, he would stand in the center of the room, stare at the corner where the closet used to be, and whimper. The only way to calm him was to let him out. Around the same time, I began to hear scratching sounds coming from that corner. People might say it could have been a mouse or a bird in the wall, but the sound was different, deeper, heavier, like something larger was making it. The scratching eventually stopped, and I sincerely hope it never returns. Story 18. My father was deployed with the United Nations in Sierra Leone during the Civil War 2 decades ago. If you know anything about what happened there, you can imagine the toll it took on someone who lived through it. My father wasn't an addict, but something inside him had broken. He managed to hide it well most of the time, but when he was angry, it was frightening. One day when I was 11 and being a difficult child, he grabbed me by the neck and screamed at me. He told me he had taken the lives of countless men in Africa, that he had seen and harmed child soldiers younger than me, and that my life could be taken just as easily for being ungrateful. The worst part was that he said it all with pride. He told me he was 3 times the man I would ever be. I still remember the exact date, February 15th, 2014, because I thought I would prove him wrong one day. It took me years to understand that I was not the one at fault for what he said. Story 19. A few years ago, I ate fish that had gone bad. It was herring and vinegar, so the spoilage wasn't obvious. It didn't taste quite right, but my mom insisted it was fine, so I finished it. Several hours later, I felt dizzy and had to lie down. I slept through the night but woke up the next morning still feeling ill. I went without food or water, thinking I would recover with rest. By the following day, I was vomiting nonstop, my world spinning as if I had downed 2 bottles of liquor. My mom drove me to the hospital, but it was a long trip. By then, I was severely dehydrated, having gone more than 30 hours without water. I couldn't stop vomiting, hanging out of the car window the whole way. My hands and legs cramped, my neck was too weak to hold up my head, and I could barely speak. I truly believed I was going to die. The strangest part was that I wasn't afraid. I felt calm, accepting that the suffering would end. That acceptance still unsettles me when I think about it now. Spoiler, I survived. At the hospital, I was given fluids through an IV. I spent the next 4 days vomiting constantly, then gradually regained strength, able to walk only a few minutes at a time. I was discharged after a week, though I remained dizzy for 2 more weeks, sometimes even falling when stepping out of the shower because the weight of the water in my hair would throw me off balance. Story 20. When my ex-husband got clean, I thought things would finally be okay. We moved into a tiny studio apartment with our baby in someone's backyard. There were red flags everywhere, but I was just relieved he seemed to be on the right path. That didn't last. Soon I wasn't allowed to have a phone, money, or a job. I couldn't even visit my grandmother, who lived across the street. It turned into a full-blown captivity situation where fights became violent. He destroyed the only photo I had of my grandfather, my hero. He hurt me, and I caught him hurting our infant son. I even suspected at one point that he tried to poison him. He split my head open with a remote, threw glass at me, and cut up my legs. He wouldn't let me clean up, likely so I couldn't reach out for help. I did call the police once, but they made me leave for the night, and my landlord was furious with me, probably because the apartment wasn't legally rented. He controlled everything, even groceries. My baby often had bottles made from boiled apples and potatoes. I hurt myself and attempted suicide several times. I lost my faith and was losing my mind. Eventually, I took my son, what little I could carry, and left. Homelessness was better than being a hostage. Later, when I look back at my notebooks from that time, I barely recognized the writing. My diary was filled with me justifying staying and downplaying the horror I was living. I still can't believe I survived. Today, I don't know where he is, and I don't want to know. I have healed through therapy, overcoming the guilt of having my son in that situation, along with the nightmares, sleep paralysis, and flashbacks. I haven't self-harmed since 2014. My son is now in first grade. He's tall, polite, fun, and kind. He sees the world differently, and I love him deeply. Maybe he saved me, giving me a reason to hold on. Since then, I've had another child, remarried, and built the life I once thought impossible. I can honestly say that I am finally happy. Story 21. This wasn't the most horrifying thing, but it's the first one that came to mind. It happened after school last year. Right before practice, my friend and I went to grab pizza, like we always did. We sat down and noticed a small group of other guys there. One of them came over and asked if he could be our friend. saying he had just moved from another school. Of course, we said yes. We all talked for a bit, and he asked if he could sit with us. After a while, we realized it was time for practice, so we walked back to the high school. The pizza place was right next to the school in a small strip with about 4 other stores. Practice was normal, and afterward we went home. The next day, we saw the new guy at lunch and said hi. For about a week, we exchanged greetings in the hallways. One afternoon, I decided to go home instead of getting pizza, since practice was not until 6 o'clock. I took a nap, only to wake up to 6 missed calls and more than 50 messages from my friends, the cheer group chat, and even my coach. When I finally answered my coach, I asked what was going on. She told me there had been a stabbing at the pizza place we usually went to every day. My heart sank. She asked where my friend was, and thankfully I was able to reach her. She hadn't gone either. I felt relief wash over me, but then I learned the truth. A student from our school had been stabbed, and it was the same boy who had just moved here, the one who had asked to sit with us. He passed away that night. For months afterward, the hallways at school were silent. Story 22. After 10 years in an abusive relationship, I finally left with my children. That day, he told me he would find me, end my life, and take the kids somewhere no one could ever locate them. The police warned me that they could not guarantee our safety, so we fled interstate, more than 3,000 kilometers away. This was already the 4th place we had tried, because he kept finding us. The new housing development we moved into wasn't even on maps or GPS yet. Emergency services had to physically map the area. Our duplex was hidden down the side of another house, through a gate behind a garage. It practically didn't exist on paper. That was the point. One night around 10 o'clock, I was hanging bedding outside after one of the kids had an accident. The clothesline was right next to the 6-foot gate. It had a small gap just big enough for a hand to reach through and unlatch it. As I was hanging the laundry, a wave of fear hit me, almost paralyzing. I turned my head slowly and saw a black-gloved hand slip out of the latch hole as the gate began to open. I said, "No," out loud. Then I saw a black shoe halfway inside. Luckily, the door to my home was right behind me. I started backing up, telling the person on the other side of the gate that I was going to get the dog. I slipped inside, latched the door, and called the police. I didn't have a dog at the time, but I do now. The police arrived in under 2 minutes. Because of my history, my number and address had been flagged for immediate emergency response. They searched but found no one, concluding the person had fled down the lane. For a month afterward, patrol cars circled the area every night. Around that time, my ex stopped calling the children during his scheduled times, which was unusual. 2 days later, he finally called and casually mentioned he had just flown back into the city. This made no sense. He was unemployed, lived in a rural area, and had no reason to be flying anywhere, especially there. I had a hunch, and the police suspected the same. 2 weeks later, while registering my protection order at the police station, they asked me to fill out a security upgrade application. They had done some digging and discovered he had booked and boarded a flight to my state on the exact day of the attempted break-in. After that, they lost track of him. Worse, they uncovered messages between him and a relative describing his plans to kill me once he found me, including disturbing details they never shared. To this day, I don't know why he didn't follow through that night. Maybe seeing me outside threw him off. Maybe my bluff about the dog scared him. Or maybe it was the police's quick response that saved me. Since then, we have moved twice more. 6 years later, he still manages to track us down. Due to a police mistake, he even found our current address. But I refuse to keep running. This is my life now, and I won't let him take it away. Story 23. Mine is a little different in that it doesn't involve anyone doing something bad, just nature being nature. I was about 10 years old, living with my aunt and 2 younger cousins. The littlest one was barely 3. One afternoon, my aunt decided to run to the store for cigarettes. The convenience store was so close I could probably have biked there and back in under 20 minutes. It was around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. A beautiful day. We knew our neighbors and could go to them if we needed help, so it seemed totally reasonable for her to step out for a few minutes. Not long after she left, the whole sky suddenly went dark. My aunt had a fan in her upstairs bedroom window with 2 sets of blades, one for pulling air in and one for pushing it out. Suddenly, it started making a crazy noise, both sets of blades spinning in the same direction, straining the motor. My cousin, who was about 7, and I rushed to lift the window and pull the fan out so we could close it. We managed to get it up, but a huge gust of wind shoved the fan into us, knocking us down. Less than 10 minutes had passed since my aunt left, but the sky was now pitch black and rain was pouring. Then I heard the sound I will never forget, the freight train roar that told me exactly what was happening. I grabbed my cousins and took them to the lowest level of the tri-level house. We huddled in a hallway, terrified, as the roar shook the house. Windows rattled, hail pounded against the walls, and we were all crying. Then my little cousin shouted that his mom was knocking at the door. I told him it was just the hail, but he broke free, ran upstairs, and opened it. He was right. Our aunt had made it back just in time. She scooped him up and hurried back down with us. Seconds later, a massive tree branch smashed through the living room window, right next to the front door. If she had still been outside, she might not have survived. The storm lasted maybe 20 to 30 minutes before the sun came out again. It tore the roof off the garage. Our living room was filled with nearly 6 inches of hail and debris from the broken window. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and I still get panic attacks when tornado warnings come through. Story 24. When I was around 19, my girlfriend's mom was hospitalized with a heart attack. My girlfriend had been through a streak of tragedies. She had been assaulted at a party, her 14-year-old dog had passed away, and her grandfather had died, all within just a few months. By the time of her mother's hospitalization, she was breaking down. I sat with her in the hospital waiting room as she sobbed, convinced the world was against her. I tried to encourage her, telling her things would be okay, the kind of words everyone has heard before. She eventually said through tears, "I just need a hug." So I gave her one. I wrapped my arms around her, patted her back, and whispered, "It's okay. Everything will be okay." But something inside her snapped. She screamed at the top of her lungs and suddenly kicked me hard in the groin, dropping me instantly. Then she began beating me. I tried to get up, but she punched me again and again. My mom had raised me to never fight a woman, so I didn't hit her back. Instead, I took the blows, trying to crawl away as she followed and kept attacking me. It went on so long that I could barely move. By the end, I was on the floor in the hallway, covered in bruises, coughing up blood, unable to call out. Finally, a doctor and nurse stumbled upon the scene. I reached out a hand trying to ask for help, but no words came. They quickly pulled her away and helped me. The doctor checked me over and found about a dozen bruises, some larger than her whole foot, plus scrapes from being dragged, a couple of small fractures in my arm and ribs, a bloody nose, some internal bleeding, and a bruise dangerously close to my windpipe. He said if the kick had landed a few centimeters differently, I might not have survived. He treated me, waived most of the costs, and only billed for the x-rays. The police questioned both of us. I pressed no charges. When I saw her afterwards, she broke down crying and ran off. A few days later, her best friend messaged me to say the relationship was over. That was when I learned the truth. What I had said and done, hugging her and whispering "it's okay," was eerily similar to what her attacker had done just before assaulting her a couple of weeks earlier. I never knew those details, and I wish I had, because maybe then things would not have unfolded that way. Story 25. Several years ago, I was at home when I noticed a terrible smell. I searched the house but found nothing, so I went outside. When I reached the backyard, I saw that an apartment across the road was on fire. I ran over and saw a car parked in the spot with the apartment number on it, so I assumed someone was inside. I tried the front door, but it wouldn't open, so I kicked it down and went inside. The smoke was thick and black, burning my eyes and nose like a faucet had been turned on. I got a woman out, and since there were toys everywhere, I went back inside. Sirens were approaching as I re-entered. I searched the kitchen and living room but didn't find a child. I went upstairs, and that was when I lost the ability to take a deep breath. Everything I touched was hot, and I could barely see. Each breath felt like inhaling pure fire. Crawling on the bedroom floor, I finally felt a small leg. By then, I was coughing so hard I was nearly vomiting with each breath. I pulled the child by the leg into the hallway, then picked her up. My vision was fading into black patches, surrounded by flashing yellow and white rings. My ears rang so loudly I could only hear my coughing and my heartbeat pounding. I tried to carry her down the stairs but collapsed after the first 2 steps. The firefighters later told me I fell down the staircase, though I don't remember it. I ended up with a broken collarbone, a broken jaw, and severe smoke inhalation. Doctors said they weren't sure how I survived, but in the end, it was all for nothing. The little girl had already died of smoke inhalation, and her mother had died from a heroin overdose. From what investigators could tell, the child had been playing with her mother's drug kit and set the comforter on fire. I almost lost my life trying to save people who were already gone. Story 26. In 2017, I had just dropped out of college because of severe depression. I started hanging out with friends who seemed supportive, but only encouraged my worst habits. We began using drugs regularly, LSD, ecstasy, painkillers. We convinced ourselves that if we were careful, nothing bad would happen. Meanwhile, our bodies were breaking down. After months of this, I accidentally overdosed on ecstasy. I was home alone when it hit. I knew what was happening before it became unbearable. I panicked. I couldn't stand without the world turning blurry and purple. For reasons I still don't understand, I called an Uber to take me to the emergency room. That poor driver unknowingly carried a dying teenager to the hospital. At the hospital, they wheeled me into a room and hooked me up to an IV. Doctors bombarded me with questions I couldn't answer. Their voices grew muffled, fading away. My vision turned into blinding white from the fluorescent lights. My body shook violently, almost like a seizure. My heart pounded as if it would burst. My breathing was shallow and my muscles spasmed like firecrackers under my skin. I felt hot and cold all at once. My mind was clear through it all, which made it worse. I was convinced I was going to die there, alone in that room. My family would only hear about it afterward, and it would devastate them. I begged the universe to let me live. I wasn't religious, but I prayed harder than I ever had in my life. Then suddenly, the pain stopped. My white vision turned black. I could breathe. I thought it was over. I drifted in and out, still hearing the doctors faintly. One nurse adjusted my IV and told me she would check on me later. I managed to mumble, "Wait." She asked what I needed. I told her, "Please, just stay. I don't want to die alone." I heard a chair scrape across the floor, and then I felt her hand in mine. She held it until I fell into real sleep. I never saw her face. I never got to say thank you. When I woke up, I was alive. They discharged me later, and eventually I told my mom, then my dad, then my sisters. Today, I'm closer with my family than ever before. I'm healthier, stronger, and though I still struggle with depression, I'm far better than I was. That night changed everything, and I'll always remember the faceless nurse who held my hand when I thought I was about to die. Story 27. I was about 12 years old, staying over with my mom at my grandfather's place for the weekend. My grandfather, who used a wheelchair, went to bed, and later my mom and I retreated to the room we shared with one bed. My mom has always been sensitive about sleeping with the television on, so she asked me to turn it off. I wasn't happy about it. I wasn't tired yet, and I hated being left alone with my thoughts in the dark, but I did as she asked. Lying there with my back to my mom in the dark hallway, I faced the freshly turned off television. Maybe 15 to 45 minutes later, I suddenly heard the sound of a light switch clicking on. The hallway light had turned on by itself, and I could see its glow reflected on the television screen. No one was there. The switch was right next to my grandfather's room, so if he had gotten up to use the bathroom, I would have heard the sound of his wheelchair moving. But the hallway was empty. About a minute and a half later, the light switched back off, again with the audible click. I was beyond terrified. I froze completely, convinced that if I didn't move or make a sound, nothing would come after me. The next day I told my mom. She dismissed it and said it was probably my grandfather, but I knew it wasn't. I never heard the sound of his wheelchair that night, and to this day, I believe no one was in that hallway. Story 28. I started secretly seeing someone behind my parents' backs. He was older and carried a presence that felt overwhelming. In time, my parents began leaving me home alone when they had errands. Since my dad owned all the neighboring houses and trusted everyone around, they thought I was safe. One night around midnight, as I sat on the couch, I noticed him outside the window watching me. He suddenly forced his way inside, and the situation became terrifying. Hours passed in fear and intimidation, with me realizing he must have been monitoring the house without me ever telling him my parents weren't home. During that same period, my grandfather was battling cancer, and my cousin had just been diagnosed as well. In the middle of all this chaos, he tried to twist everything, cruelly telling me that their suffering was somehow my fault. At one point, he tried to rip off my pants after throwing me on the bed, but I held them so tightly that he only tore the fabric before giving up. Desperate, I ran upstairs, kicked out a window, and tried to escape, but he grabbed me. His mom was parked in the woods nearby, calling his phone because she wanted to leave. I convinced him to go to her car with me, promising to say he was staying the night. As soon as we stepped outside, adrenaline took over, and I sprinted toward her car. I tried to jump in, but she slammed the door shut and locked it. I looked at her in disbelief as he dragged me back into the house by my hair. He beat me for another hour before finally leaving. That night, I sat pulling glass from my feet from my failed escape and searched YouTube for makeup tutorials to cover my bruises. To this day, what haunts me most is that his own mother locked the door on me, refusing to help a child. Story 29. Back in the early 1990s when I was a kid, our family lived in a small town in Yorkshire. Our driveway had a gate between two large stone eagle statues. It was a quiet area. Cars passed only a couple of times an hour. One morning, we woke up to find one of the eagles missing. The strange part was how clean the removal was. There was no damage, no debris, just a perfectly smooth cut, as if the statue had been lifted away effortlessly. The gate wasn't far from the house, but nobody had heard a thing. Almost a week later, a neighbor down the road came by and said he had found our missing eagle in his skip. He returned it, and it was in perfect condition, as if nothing had happened. Still, it was bizarre. A few days later, I was alone in my room, sitting on the windowsill that overlooked the front of the house. That's when I saw a black stretch limousine turn onto our road. In our quiet little town, seeing a limousine in the middle of the afternoon was shocking enough, so I watched closely. The car stopped right in front of our gate, and a man stepped out. He looked like he had stepped out of another era, dressed like an old-fashioned driver, complete with gloves and a hat he removed as he got out. He was bald, completely hairless, with no eyebrows. He walked over to the post where the eagle had once stood and ran his hand over the smooth surface. He stood there for a while, looking around, before getting back into the limousine and driving away. To this day, I can still picture it clearly. It remains one of the strangest, most inexplicable things I have ever witnessed. Story 30. I used to live in a fairly small town where there wasn't much to do as a teenager. One thing I enjoyed, thanks to my parents, was visiting antique stores and browsing through old items. During my senior year of high school, I went to a large antique store and came across a Ouija board from the 1970s or 80s. Being a skeptical agnostic, I thought it would be a fun thing to try with friends. Nothing crazy happened, except I experienced my first episode of sleep paralysis around that time. The next year, I took the board with me to college. My friend and I convinced some girls from his dorm to use it in a small cemetery on campus, where the landowners from the early 1800s were buried. That night, I stashed the board under my bed before sleeping. As I dozed off, I saw images of skulls flying toward me, almost like pre-dream visuals. At 3 in the morning, I woke from a nightmare with the strangest feeling, like I was partially paralyzed, then released. It felt as though two long arms lifted off me and slipped under my bed. Terrified, I looked beneath it and saw the Ouija board. Too creeped out to stay alone, I planned to go to the 24-hour library. Just as I stepped out, my neighbor across the hall came out. I told him what happened, and he offered to walk around my room holding a picture of the Virgin Mary that he said had been blessed by a holy man in Mexico. Skeptical, I agreed anyway. The next day, I gave him the board, relieved to be rid of it. Years later, I ran into him at a bar. After catching up, he asked if I remembered the board. He told me he had given it to his mother, and soon after, strange things began happening in her house. Lights flickering, noises. Eventually, she burned it. Maybe anticlimactic, but during the time I owned it, my life felt unusually dark. I remain skeptical, but I'm more open-minded about the supernatural now. One thing's for sure, I'll never touch a Ouija board again. Story 31. About 10 years ago, I lived in a tiny town in the Japanese countryside. I wasn't native to Japan, and my family and I were the only foreigners in the area, which made me stand out. One night during the town's annual celebration, everyone was out drinking and partying. I spent the evening with my husband and 2 young children, and afterward, they went home while I joined a friend for karaoke. We stayed out very late, long after the festivities ended. When I left the bar, I realized I had no way to get home except to walk. There were no taxis, and my husband was asleep, not answering his phone. The walk was just over a mile, but it was completely dark, and I had to pass through a park and past a large Shinto temple, which already felt eerie in daylight. That night, it was terrifying. There were no streetlights, and I could barely see my own hands. I muttered prayers under my breath the entire way, just begging to make it home safely. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sent shivers up my spine. By the time I got back, I swore I would never do something so foolish again. Story 32. Back in 2013, when I was in college, I had to fill out some paperwork. A guy doing his service hours helped process it, and although I barely noticed him, he developed an obsession. Since he handled my documents, he had access to my personal information. Soon he began stalking me. He knew where I lived, where I worked, my schedule, my phone number and email, everything. He texted me from different numbers, followed me on campus, and even showed up at my job once. He would accuse me of being cruel for not giving him a chance, claiming he could make me the happiest girl alive. I reported him to the college principal, and security issued a restriction order, banning him from entering the engineering school where I studied. 3 years later, I started a new job, only for him to appear there too. He said he had just started working in the same building and suggested we hang out. I reported it again, and my boss worked with building security to keep him off our floor. But soon after, he called me from a blocked number, screaming that I was ruining his life. I was so terrified that I quit my job. I haven't heard from him in 2 years, and I pray it stays that way. If someone says no, never push them. Obsession isn't love, it's dangerous. Story 33. A few years ago, my sister dated a guy I'll call Jack. He was a Navy veteran who had seen combat. At first, things seemed fine, but she later discovered troubling things about him and broke up with him. When he left the service, he struggled with PTSD and depression. On top of that, he was secretly using heavy drugs and showing signs of serious instability. Even after the breakup, my sister wanted to remain friends, hoping to support him through his struggles. He wasn't a bad person, but he clearly wasn't okay. One night last winter, she called me while driving. Her voice was tense. Jack had gotten hold of a handgun and was having suicidal thoughts. She was on her way to his apartment to take the gun from him. She lived 3 hours away from me, so I couldn't do much but stay on the phone. To be safe, she had her friend send me his address and stay in contact too. My job was to check in constantly in case something went wrong. My heart was racing the entire time. I couldn't stop imagining worst-case scenarios. What if he hurt her? What if it was a setup? What if he pulled the trigger while she was there? I kept grilling her with random questions only she would know, just to make sure I was actually talking to her and not him using her phone to pretend everything was okay. Looking back, maybe it was excessive, but in the moment, the paranoia was overwhelming. When she arrived, Jack opened the door and, to my relief, immediately handed her the gun. They sat on the curb for over an hour as she talked him down, convincing him to hold on. Eventually, she left with the weapon. I think he got professional help afterward, but I'm not sure. All I know is that I clutched my phone like a lifeline that night, terrified of losing my sister or hearing the worst. I think she still talks to him sometimes, and I hope he's in a better place now. Story 34. This happened about a month and a half ago, and I still can't get it out of my head. A friend and I had been out shopping, and around 9 o'clock we decided to get dinner. As we pulled into a restaurant parking lot near the mall, I heard the sound of screeching tires. When I turned, I saw a car vault off the freeway embankment, flip 180 degrees, and land on an on-ramp before rolling over twice. As it tumbled, debris flew everywhere. A dark mass was flung from the car and landed on the road I had just driven down seconds earlier. I jumped out, called 911, and ran toward the scene with others. I stayed on ground level while a few bystanders climbed the fence to reach the burning car. They pulled out a woman and her newborn baby. She was frantic, screaming for her husband. One of the bystanders looked down toward me and pointed. "Is that him?" he asked. I turned and realized the black mass I had seen fall was her husband. He'd been ejected mid-roll, thrown from the freeway down to the road below. I tried to talk to him, but there was no response. His head trauma was massive. His wife's screams pierced the air, cutting through everything else. I can still hear them in my head. Within minutes, cars started approaching the scene. I had to wave them off until mall security arrived. After about 5 minutes, paramedics and firefighters reached the scene, extinguishing the car fire and tending to the woman and baby. It took longer for them to reach her husband, but by then he was gone. It wasn't just the violence of the crash or even seeing death up close that stuck with me. It was her screams, the raw grief of losing her husband in an instant while clutching her newborn child. Since then, I've found myself thinking a lot more about death. I've never been religious, but now I'm more afraid of dying than ever before. That moment didn't just scar me, it changed the way I see life. Story 35. I am realizing now that I've been through more than I thought. Almost being abducted as a child, fending off would-be home invaders, stumbling upon dead animals in strange places, finding live animals where they shouldn't be, even witnessing a patient predict his own death, and watching a so-called professional hypnotist exploit another person's passing. But the one experience that haunts me most is my grandfather's death. I'm a nurse, and my grandfather was dying of lung cancer. He was my best friend in the world, and I spent his last 2 weeks bathing him, feeding him, talking with him, and simply being by his side. For the first 10 days, he was lucid and fully aware he was dying. We spoke about his life in detail, and I even recorded a few of his stories for my daughter to have someday. Each day, I watched as the lack of oxygen slowly chipped away at him. The day before he died, he seemed unusually alert, cheerful, and hungry. I knew this surge of energy often meant the end was close. I'd seen it many times before with patients. The next time he woke, he was confused, asking random questions and believing he was decades younger. When his breathing turned shallow and agonal, my mom, grandmother, aunt, and I gathered around him. We held him as he struggled, taking one breath a minute. My grandmother whispered that I should tell him it was okay to let go, that he would listen to me. Through tears, I told him he didn't need to suffer anymore, that I would take care of the family. He drew his last breath. When he died, I lost more than my grandfather. I lost my best friend, much of my confidence, and the ability to feel excitement the way I once did. It's been 3 years, and I still think about him every single day. Story 36. It's not like I live in some kind of Teletubbies world where nothing bad happens, but the year 2020 felt like a horror movie for me. Not in the sense of monsters, but in the way everything felt surreal and twisted. Early that year, I suddenly became a single father to my 3-year-old son, overnight. The city gave me some support, but as the months went on, I felt emptier and more drained. Being a single parent is already tough. Being introverted doesn't help. Add in the isolation of the pandemic, and I felt like my batteries were dying. My little boy had lived almost like a caged animal before he came to me. No social awareness, no understanding of how to be around others, scared of noise and crowds. Doctors suspected infantile autism, though no one could say for sure yet. I've been doing my best for him, but it's crushing to feel like nobody's looking out for me in the process. He's learning a new world from me, one that I hope will be brighter after the pandemic, but he doesn't even know yet what it's like to have a real extended family. Mine chose to stay away because he's different. The ignorance of people kills me. Not just family, but friends too, who I thought were my people. They stay away. My son is excluded because he's not normal, and that eats me alive. On top of it, we have to save every cent. If something breaks, like the washing machine, there's no one to help. Other kids get Nintendo Switches and piles of gifts, while I sacrifice buying myself a winter coat just so my son can have the jacket he needs to jump in puddles. His alcoholic mother does nothing but drink and somehow still gets money and luxury, while I work nonstop and get nothing back from the world. I keep pushing on for him. I'd give him everything, but some days I just wish someone, anyone, would see me too. Even something small, a coupon for a free burger in the newspaper, would feel like acknowledgement. Instead, the world feels cold, empty, and cruel. People suggest sending my son to special care 5 days a week, like they forget he's just a child. He doesn't speak yet, and sometimes he explodes in frustration, but he has his reasons. He's trying, and I'll never stop fighting for him, even when I feel like I have nothing left.